accordingly.
That's not what I said. You put words in my mouth. I said, should he be able to render an opinion, and should the Fed take that into consideration?
No.
I think he should be able to have an opinion.
I didn't say anything.
And they should take that into consideration. It shouldn't be the only thing.
I didn't
but
say
he should
anything.
have an opinion.
The president can have whatever opinions he wants. Yeah. What I'm asking is whether the Fed should be independent in their decision-making from those opinions.
I said, does that mean they can take his opinion into consideration? And I think they should take the president's opinion into consideration. That is not the only thing. That's one of the things.
In this video, Scott Jennings joins the panel on NewsNight with Abby Phillip. It quickly becomes apparent that Jennings is growing increasingly frustrated with what he views as the panel's misleading and dishonest framing of Donald Trump's tariffs. As the discussion heats up, Jennings pushes back hard, clearly positioning himself as the contrarian voice in the room. With that context in mind, let's watch Scott Jennings step in to remind the CNN panel and the audience why he's often treated as the network's go-to MAGA antagonist, and, in his own view, one of the biggest draws on what he would call their otherwise unserious channel.
Well, the Fed is obviously independent. It's supposed to be independent, but independence in Trump's head does not exist. He does not understand why a federal government must be independent from himself. He believes that his power and the executive branch's power should dictate what happens with the Fed and with the Department of Justice and with our military, with all of the various things that should be independent. The reality is, as you talk about, Trump being spooked, it's a little late for Trump to be spooked at this point. We've been talking about tariffs. He has been talking about this for quite some time. The markets are in disarray. We're heading toward a recession. Everybody is saying that this is a terrible thing. And yet for just now, all of a sudden he woke up and he realized, this is a terrible thing for our economy and our country.
I just have to respond to your assertion that the federal government should operate independently of the elected president of the United States. You mentioned the Fed, and
the Department of Justice.
You said DOJ, which is obviously appointed and works for the president.
No, but it's independent. Your laws should not be enforced based on the president. They should be enforced based on the law.
You said the military. Obviously, he's the commander-in-chief of the military. I'm just trying to figure out what percentage or part of the government that you think should run away from the president.
There are institutions that are independent. I'm going to step in here
because I don't want us to change the subject, okay? We are talking about the independence of the Fed. Do you agree or disagree that the Fed should be independent?
I think the president should be able to
that
render
actually
an opinion
about that is a
monetary
yes
policy.
Or no.
Whether he should be able to fire him is an open question.
That is a yes or no question. But should the Fed be independent of the whims of any president of the United States?
I think the president ought to be able to have opinions.
Why can't you say yes or no?
Previous presidents
I think it's an open question where they should be able to fire the head of the Fed. Some Republican senators don't agree.
So, Scott.
But I don't. Right. I just think the idea that the president should not have any opinion.
Here's what that really exposes. What's being framed as rudeness or media bias is actually something deeper and more revealing. It's a sustained attempt to turn democratic limits into personal insults. Yes, the president can have opinions. Every president does. That part isn't controversial. But in a democracy, opinions are not commands. And that distinction isn't semantic. It's structural. The moment you start treating disagreement or independence as sabotage, you're no longer talking about governance. You're talking about dominance. Listen closely. This is the tell. The argument quietly shifts from the Fed should listen to the system is working against him. That's not an economic argument. It's a grievance narrative. Independent institutions aren't evaluated on outcomes anymore. They're judged on loyalty. Here's the contradiction that matters. We're told Trump just wants to do his job, but the job of the presidency has always included friction. Courts reviewing executive power isn't resistance. It's constitutional enforcement. An independent Federal Reserve isn't defiance. It's a safeguard against political manipulation of the economy. That's not Democrats inventing hurdles. That's democracy doing exactly what it was designed to do. And this is where democracy meets denial. Accountability gets rebranded as persecution. Oversight becomes obstruction. And suddenly, every institution that says no is accused of stealing power from the voters, when in reality, those institutions exist to protect voters from concentrated power. Let's be real, you've seen this before. Strong leadership doesn't require silencing checks or sidelining independence. In fact, history tells us the opposite. The strongest systems are the ones where power is shared, constrained, and forced to justify itself. That's the real takeaway here. This isn't about whether a president gets a voice. It's about whether any one person gets to be louder than the law. And in a democracy, the answer has to be no, every single time.
And about monetary policy,
I'm going to give you a third try on this one. Should the Fed's decisions about how they operate, the interest rates, when they raise or lower them, should they be independent of the President of the United States?
Does independent mean they don't take his opinion into consideration?
Independent means no, they don't take his opinion into consideration.
I don't agree with that. I'm sorry. I think the president.
Okay.
I think the president should be able to render an opinion. I'm going to ask Charlotte, what do you this was taken in by the markets, that idea, right, this week. What was the reaction among people who are making money, they have businesses, they are operating in the financial world to this idea that people like Scott believe that the Fed should be listening to the president and act accordingly? That's not what I said. You put words in my mouth. I said, should he be able to render an opinion, and should the Fed take that into consideration?
No.
I think he should be able to have an opinion.
I didn't say anything.
And they should take that into consideration. It shouldn't be the only thing.
I didn't
but
say
he should
anything.
have an opinion.
The president can have whatever opinions he wants. Yeah. What I'm asking is whether the Fed should be independent in their decision-making from those opinions.
And I said, does that mean they can take his opinion into consideration? And I think they should take the president's opinion into consideration. That's not the only thing.
Let me see if Charlotte has some thoughts on this.
I think it's very clear from the market's response that not just the desired outcome, the fundamental law of nature needs to be that the Federal Reserve, the chair of the Federal Reserve, makes decisions on monetary policy that are based on economic data, not on the whims of a president. And that's very, very clear. And I think, the job of the Fed is complex, particularly in the environment in which Trump has placed Jerome Powell, where you have a threat of slowing growth and increasing inflation due to these tariffs, right? So you have a stagflationary environment that's very hard for the Fed to manage. It is true that some investors probably, if Jerome Powell were to lower interest rates.
If you like watching videos like this one, like and subscribe. We'd really appreciate it. Let's get back to the video.
I'm not going to predict how the market would respond. However, it's very, very clear that the market responds extremely negatively to even a hint that the president might intervene.
There's a direct
intervening and rendering an opinion are two different things.
There's a direct effect here with the American worker that has to do with China and with the stock market that people are seeing every day. Donald Trump ran on being tough on China, and workers and folks in America, they love that talk. They love being tough on China, but they also love getting really cheap stuff from Walmart, and they can't have both at the same time. And I think that's why you see him backing off of that. With the stock market, regular folks don't understand Dows and bonds and all that, but they understand their 401k. And I think that's where the pressure's coming from, is people around there saying, you're hurting your own people. And so you see people backing down.
Do you
there's an argument.
honestly believe the president shouldn't be able to render opinions about monetary policy?
You keep repeating something that nobody ever said. No one ever said that Trump cannot have
having original thoughts here.
No, Scott. No one ever said that Trump can't have an opinion. The question is, should the Fed act based on that opinion? And I think it's just common sense, right? The Fed, it should be acting based on...
Listen closely. This is where the argument gives itself away. What's being implied here is that accountability is the enemy of action. That if Trump were just given more control, things would magically get done, beat. But in a democracy, unchecked control isn't efficiency, it's risk. Here's the contradiction that matters. Yes, past administrations deported large numbers of undocumented immigrants. That's a fact. But those deportations happen within legal frameworks, court oversight, and due process. The issue now isn't whether enforcement exists, it's how it's carried out. Law enforcement constrained by courts isn't weakness. It's the rule of law doing its job. And this is where democracy meets distortion. Complex legal cases get flattened into outrage headlines. Due process becomes national news hysteria. But when someone is accused of serious crimes, the system is supposed to move carefully, transparently, and lawfully. That's not political sabotage. That's basic justice. Notice the psychological move here. Any resistance is framed as fear. Any scrutiny is framed as partisan panic. The suggestion is that if Democrats didn't interfere, Republicans would win, and everything would work. But democracies don't function on fear of one side winning. They function on shared rules that apply no matter who's in power. Let's be real. You know this already. If the standard is, my side should be able to act without challenge, that standard will eventually be used against everyone. That's why independent courts, media scrutiny, and institutional limits exist in the first place. Here's the grounded truth. Getting things done isn't about overpowering the system. It's about working within it, respecting rights, and accepting that democracy is slower by design, because the cost of speed without limits is far higher. That's the takeaway. This isn't about stopping victories. It's about making sure that when power is exercised, it's exercised lawfully, humanely, and in a way that still looks like democracy when the moment passes.